Hi, everybody out there. Welcome. My name is John Horgan. I'm director of the Center for Science Writings, which is really just a fancy name for this lecture series that I've been running at Stevens since 2005. And I want to start today by telling you about how this event came about. So just before Christmas, I was planning lectures for this spring, and I thought I really need to get somebody good. I want to get somebody important, a real big shot, and also somebody who is really optimistic, because almost everybody I know is feeling really bad about humanity these days for obvious reasons. And the person who immediately came to mind is Steven Pinker, who is our guest speaker today. So Pinker is certainly one of the most influential intellectuals on the planet, and also I would say one of the most optimistic, although he's not crazy about the word optimistic as applied to him. And maybe we can get into that a little bit, but his most recent book, Enlightenment Now, I see as very optimistic, although driven by data. It's a work of empirical optimism, you might say. The thesis of the book is that things are getting better and better for more and more people around the world, and they have been for a couple of centuries now. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So I reached out to Pinker, and he, I'm thrilled to say, agreed to do this, agreed to appear before a Stevens audience today. It might be because he came to Stevens once before in the flesh back in 2007. He came to talk about one of his books on language, The Stuff of Thought. And he seemed to have a good time, so maybe that's why he was willing to come back to talk to us again today. So what we're doing today is actually what we did back then, which is instead of Steve giving a formal lecture, we're going to have a conversation. Let me just say that there's a Q&A function that I guess all of you can see at the bottom of your screen. And after Steve and I talk for a while, you can submit questions through that Q&A function, and we'll go scrolling through them and pick out the absolutely best ones. So Steve, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me back. You're right, I did have a good time when I was there in the flesh, and here I am in the pixels.
Yeah. So my first question is, I've been sort of looking back at your career, and it seems to me that there are two parts to it. So the first couple of decades, you were doing really well, writing books about language and cognition and how the mind works. And that's pretty much an inexhaustible topic. Then you switched about 10 years ago to talking about human progress. And so your last two big books have been on that topic. Better Angels of Our Nature, which came out, I think, 10 years ago. And then more recently, Enlightenment Now. Both of those books focus on progress in human history. So I wonder if you could start by explaining why that swerve in your interests.
Yeah, how did I get here? And I still alternate in my books generally between ones on language and cognition and ones on human nature, human progress, big picture issues. The transition was actually an issue that you and I have gone back and forth on, and that is whether a belief in human nature should be tied to a kind of fatalism about human progress. In particular, when it comes to violence, that's the most obvious example. And there is a long tradition of people worrying that if you acknowledge that there's a dark side to human nature, that we may have impulses that can erupt in violence, like vengeance and dominance, then does that kind of mean, well, war is in our genes, there's nothing we can do about it? maybe war is even healthy and spiritual and ennobling. And in my book, The Blank Slate, which was a defense of human nature, I wanted to put a lot of daylight between the view I was advocating there, namely that there is such a thing as human nature, and any kind of reactionary or fatalist or necessarily conservative political view, noting two things. One of them is just theoretically, human nature is complex. So even if we do have some ugly impulses, we also have faculties that can repress them, like self-control, like empathy, like cognitive processes that can be set to solving problems, like how do we reduce violence as a problem to be solved. And I threw in a couple of observations that there can't really be a debate as to whether social change is possible, because it's happened, and in particular in the domain of violence. Not every period has the same level of violence. And I noted that in, almost offhand, that there's some dramatic cases in which violence declined. Slavery was abolished. The Soviet Empire fell almost entirely free of violence. And I also noted that the one data set that I had stumbled across from my readings in evolutionary psychology on violence was that some historical criminologists had gone back and tried to estimate homicide rates in England since the Middle Ages. And they found that the homicide rates had plummeted, that you're about 35 times more likely to be murdered in 14th century England than today. So I threw that in, and I reiterated those observations in a blog post. In fact, speaking of optimism, this was from our friend John Brockman, his website, edge.org. And one year, his annual question was, what are you optimistic about? So I guess perhaps I am optimistic because I took the bait. And as my example, I said, here's some examples of violence going down. And then I got correspondence from strangers in various academic fields that I barely knew existed, saying, you could have cited more examples of historical declines in violence. Did you know that since the end of World War II, rates of death in wars have gone down? Someone else said, did you know that violence against women has gone down in the last 40 years? Someone else said, child abuse has gone down. Someone else said, it's not just England where there's been a decrease in violence since the Middle Ages, but every European country for which we have data. And I was, I kind of realized, geez, these are scholars that know nothing about each other's existence. It all seems to show a kind of pattern. Number one, people should know about this because it does change your worldview, including your view of whether progress is possible. And also as a psychologist, it posed the challenge of, well, how do you explain it? Why were our ancestors so violent, and what have we done right? So it seems like a big juicy topic for a book, and that's led to The Better Angels of Our Nature. The title, which of course I stole from Abraham Lincoln, captures the idea that the human nature is complex. We have better angels, but they have to contend with our inner demons. And then after that book was published, I had another epiphany when I read first a small book by Charles Kenny called Getting Better, and then came across other data, including from Hans Rosling, the late Swedish doctor and TED Talk star, showing that it wasn't just in violence where the world has made progress, but in extreme poverty, in literacy, in lifespan, in child mortality. And once again, I thought this was an interesting, underappreciated fact, and it needs both to be put between a pair of covers and some semblance of an explanation. So that was my personal trajectory from, actually I even left out the prologue, the preface before I wrote a book on human nature. I was interested in faculties like language, influenced among other people, Noam Chomsky's proposal that we learn language because it's in some sense built into us. Chomsky's famous hypothesis of an innate universal grammar. That's, I think, one of the things that got me interested in the whole concept of human nature. And Chomsky, early in his career, wrote about the roots of belief in human nature in rationalist philosophy. That's what, even before the story began, got me interested in human nature. So that was the trajectory from an interest in language and cognition to human progress.
So you've kind of answered my second question, but I'm going to answer it anyway. And the blank slate, you espouse, as I recall, what you call a tragic view of human existence. And by that, I think you meant that our biology, our evolutionary heritage constrains what we can do. And it means that some of our visions of utopia will never be realized. But it seems to me that Enlightenment Now and Better Angels of Our Nature, and some of the things that you just said, are profoundly optimistic and talk a lot about the malleability of human behavior and how the constraints on our possible futures are actually quite loose. So sometimes your work is described as being kind of in the tradition of, I don't know, people who emphasize biology when they talk about human nature, and that leads to conservative political positions. But it seems like Enlightenment Now and some of the things that you were just describing are consistent with a very progressive view of the future. So is that a contradiction there? Or?
Yeah, it's a tension, and I certainly, after writing The Blank Slate, I think I have become more, at least small p, progressive, and yeah, I guess more optimistic even. Although I wouldn't use the word malleable so much as that is, it's not like the human mind is a blank slate or clay to be formed, but rather a gadget with a lot of parts, and we can kind of try to hack it by setting up norms and institutions that marginalize our dark side, our inner demons, and allow our better angels, for lack of a better term, to prevail. So you're right that there is the term, by the way, tragic vision, I took from Thomas Sowell in a brilliant book called The Conflict of Visions, where he tried to get at the root of what holds all of the traditionally conservative positions together and all the traditionally liberal or progressive positions together. And he suggested they come from different visions of human malleability, which he attributed to Edmund Burke, the famous Anglo-Irish, really father of intellectual conservatism, and William Godwin, who he kind of christened the father of liberalism. And it's whether he contrasted a utopian vision, that anything is possible, with a tragic vision that humans are saddled with certain shortcomings. Now, I try to, while laying out that tension, I try to kind of circumvent it by saying that there is a tragic element to the human condition. We're really not angels. We're subject to egocentrism and cognitive biases and all kinds of ugly motives. On the other hand, we're also smart, and we can try to invent workarounds like democratic governance, like science, like the rule of law. So we're not going to have, it's tragic in the sense that I'm not an anarchist. I don't believe in abolishing the police. I don't believe in abolishing government, precisely because of a tragic vision that says they're left to their own devices. People can get into trouble. On the other hand, we are also smart enough to develop these norms and institutions, and we do have the ability sometimes to chafe under them, but we are better off under liberal democracy and rule of law, and that really does drive down rates of violence, even though it's not the age of Aquarius.
Okay, so now I think you're going to present us with some charts that are at the heart of Enlightenment Now, that will give us kind of the big picture of where humanity is going. And I just want to say, as a preface to this, that I've been telling people in my family and friends that I'm about to have this conversation with you. And my stepmom, who is a good liberal Democrat, very progressive, but thinks any idea of progress is absolute nonsense. She emailed me a quote that she said came from Tom Stoppard, the famous playwright, that a pessimist is a well-informed optimist. So I'm hoping that you will provide something here that can serve as a rebuttal for that.
So so I'll make here a very quick case for progress. And obviously the first question is, well, what do you mean by progress? And actually, I don't think that's that hard a question to answer. Progress, I define as improvements in human flourishing. What is human flourishing? There are dimensions like life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they've increased over time, I submit that would be progress. So let's look at some of the data. And I divided the graphs into these rubrics. So beginning with life, that's obviously the most precious thing of all. Life expectancy at birth for most of human history hovered around 30 years of age. But since the public health revolution of the 19th century, it has increased worldwide to about 70, 71. I think it's even a little bit higher now. In rich countries to more than 80. And there you see Asia and Africa. Child mortality, that's got to be one of the worst things that can befall someone, the loss of a child, which historically was often around 30%, as 1 out of every 3 kids did not live to see their 5th birthday. But then that was brought down in countries like Sweden by a factor of about 100, followed by countries in North America, in Asia, in Latin America, and in sub-Saharan Africa, child mortality has been drastically falling as well. Health, very much on people's minds. We are have always been sitting ducks for pathogens. You and I are big, yummy hunks of gingerbread there for the eating from a germ's-eye point of view. And human history, to an extent I did not appreciate probably until this year, is really a battle of our own bodily integrity against the little bugs that try to eat us from inside, that can evolve faster than we can. On the other hand, the reason that we're not all dead is that even after more than 1 billion years of pathogens and parasites, so first of all, we have an immune system, we have sexual reproduction, but we also have public health. We have vaccines and antibiotics and antisepsis. And even in the last 15 years, there has been, whoops, what happened there? Oh yeah, declines in the 5 biggest killers of children, namely pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Now, the pandemics absolutely set back progress. Progress is not linear, it's not monotonic, and pandemics are a good example. This notch that you see in life expectancy at birth in a set of wealthy countries, affluent countries from over the last 140 years or so. First time I saw this graph, I thought, oh, this is the tragedy of war. This is around the time of World War I, and look what it did to human life expectancy. Wrong. The effect of war is actually kind of a blip compared to the effect of the Spanish flu. That's what really drove this down. But it did recover. And that was before antibiotics, before vaccines, of course. And it's a similar story applies to the other great pandemic of the 20th century, namely HIV/AIDS, where this notch in life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa was the tragedy of AIDS, but thanks to antiretrovirals and programs like PEPFAR that make them available, life expectancy has took off again. And that's, I think, almost certainly going to happen going forward now with COVID, with the vaccination program, that which is not to minimize the enormous death and suffering of the past year, which is a reminder that when progress happens, it is, as I said, not monotonic. There are setbacks, there are reversals, and they can still happen. But it means that when human ingenuity is applied to a problem, sometimes we can succeed. Sustenance, famine was, for most of human history, never more than one bad harvest away. But thanks to advances in agronomy, the British agricultural revolution, with advances like crop rotation, breeding of vigorous hybrids, synthetic fertilizer, networks of transportation and storage like railroad cars and canals and granaries and refrigeration. Famine now it has not vanished, but it takes place basically in war zones in some of the most remote corners of the world where the problem is not enough food, but an inability to get it to people who need it. The world's got plenty of food for the first time in history. And undernourishment, not as severe a consequence of food shortages as famines, but has been in decline. But in the developing world, it was 30%, 35% 50 years ago. It has fallen to less than 15%, first in Latin America, then in Asia, and it's starting to fall in sub-Saharan Africa, the world's poorest region, although there's still an awful lot of suffering left to be eradicated. Prosperity, for most of humanity, there was no economic, most of human history, there was no economic growth to speak of. Then the Industrial Revolution happened, and gross world product, which previously had kind of clung to the floor for 1,500 years, where economic growth was less than 1 pixel high, then shot up about 200-fold, with the result not just that the rich got richer, but that the poor got less poor. Extreme poverty, probably 200 years ago, by today's standards, probably was the fate of about 90% of humanity. Today, it's less than 9%. As a result, inequality, though it has grown within developed countries, it has shrunk worldwide because poor countries have gotten richer faster than rich countries have gotten richer. So it increased as, starting in the 19th century when the affluent West, well, the West became affluent, it pulled away from the rest of the world, but then it has turned a corner and now the gap between rich and poor countries is shrinking. Within rich countries, even though inequality has increased and alarmingly in the last 40 years or so, it doesn't mean that rich countries get more and more callous toward the less well-off. Quite the contrary, the historical trajectory is that from a baseline 150 years ago of about 1.5% of GDP being redistributed by rich countries to sick children, sick people, children, the aged. Every developed country has gone on a spree of redistribution in the 20th century. And so they're within a range of between 20 and 30%, but there's no such thing as a developed country without an extensive social safety net. As a result, poverty in the United States, when it's measured in net of government benefits and adjusted for purchasing power, has gone down from about a third of Americans in 1960, 60 years ago, to about 7% today in terms of disposable income. In terms of what you can buy, it's down to maybe about 3%. Peace, this is something of which John and I have an interest. For most of human history, the natural state of relations between empires and big countries was war, and peace was just an interlude between wars, leading to the notion that war is a permanent part of the human condition. But if you look at the percentage of years in which the great powers were at each other's throats in wars, it has gone way down over the last half millennium, from pretty much all the time to pretty much none of the time. The last great power war, that is the two 800-pound gorillas at each other's throats, was the Korean War in 60 years ago. Now, there is, to put it mildly, in the case of war, the progress has by no means been steady or linear, and this is a picture of the 20th century. And you can't help but notice two massive spikes of bloodletting. That's World War I, World War II, and some of the wars in the aftermath of World War II, like the Chinese Civil War. But then a surprising thing happened after World War II. John and I grew up with predictions that World War III was inevitable and it would be nuclear. And if you look at kind of what happened after World War II, the rate of death from all wars combined, including civil wars and colonial wars, went from about 20 per 100,000 per year in 1946 to less than 1 per 100,000 per year today. It was kind of an ugly roller coaster because it had peaks for Vietnam, for Iran, Iraq, for Syria, but still you can't help but notice the overall downward trajectory. Freedom and rights. Now, there's been a unmistakable recession of democracy in the last 10 or 15 years, not least in our own country, hopefully stanched. But still, if you look at the last couple of hundred years, 250 years ago, the typical means of criminal punishment included things like breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing with iron hooks, sawing from the crotch down, and impalement. But then, around the time of the Enlightenment, there was a wave of abolitions of judicial torture that included our own Eighth Amendment with the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, but country after country abolished torture and as a routine form of criminal punishment. Democracy versus autocracy, even though, as I said, there has been a recession, still, if you look at the overall progression, compared even to when the 1970s, when I was a student, when half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain and ruled by Soviet communist dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist. Almost all of Latin America was under the control of military governments. East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, all of them more or less democratic today. Death penalty might be on its way out, despite, as often happens, the United States being kind of an outlier. That we still execute people, but more and more countries don't. Homosexuality has been decriminalized in country after country, although there are still some, namely in Africa and the Middle East, that continue to criminalize it. Also abolished around the time of the Enlightenment, hence my using the word enlightenment as the title of my book, Enlightenment Now. But witch hunts, religious persecution like heretic burning, dueling among men of honor, blood sports like bear baiting, debtors' prisons, and of course, most famously of all, slavery. So slavery used to be legal everywhere on earth. No one seemed to have any problem with it. The Bible had no problem with slavery. So-called democratic Athens was a slaveholding society. But then beginning in the early Enlightenment, there was a trickle of abolitions that grew into a flood, culminating in 1980 when Mauritania became the last country to abolish legal slavery. Now, there's still illegal slavery, but slave markets and governments enforcing slave ownership for the first time in human history does not exist anywhere on the planet. We're in a time of intense focus on racial progress, and it's unquestionable that there is still racism in the United States, but it is not true that there has been no racial progress. The most obvious example being lynchings, which used to take place at about a rate of about three a week in the end of the 20th century, and has declined starting in the 1950s to about zero. There are still hate crimes, but lynchings used to be occasions to bring out the whole family for a night of entertainment, to watch someone being tortured and hanged. Racist attitudes, when measured explicitly, if you ask people, for example, would you move out if a Black family moved in next door? From 1940 to the present, it's declined almost to the range of current opinion. Do you believe that Black and white students should go to separate schools? Again, it used to be a majority opinion. Now it's similar to other opinions like, have you been abducted by aliens? Now, cynics about racial progress would say, well, all that means is that people know that racism is uncouth, and so they don't confess these attitudes to pollsters. But isn't there a lot of implicit prejudice? Well, I happen to be a colleague of the world's expert on implicit prejudice, Mahzarin Banaji, and her former student Tessa Charlesworth, who have data from the implicit association test going back to the dawn of social media, the early part of the 21st century. They found in their data there's been a decline in just the rate at which people unconsciously associate African-American faces with negative adjectives. So not something that anyone would confess to, but that you see in the reaction time data. And I've looked at an unlikely source of implicit prejudice, but how often do people search Google for racist jokes? And again, that has absolutely plummeted just in the last 20 years or so. It's not just an American phenomenon, but worldwide. Regimes of apartheid and Jim Crow-like laws have been declining, while the opposite type of policies, what we call in the United States affirmative action, policies that compensate for disadvantage and discrimination, are now more prevalent than invidious policies like apartheid and Jim Crow. Violent crime, as I said, this is what kind of got me going. And from the Middle Ages to the present, there have been drastic declines in every European country. It happened then again in the US from when the then frontier in New England came under the control of the rule of law. It happened again in the American Wild West. And even Mexico, which continues to have a pretty high rate of homicide, it was about 5 times higher a century ago. So it seems to be a process that happens as anarchic frontier regions come under the control of law, and the code of manly honor and blood feuding and vendetta gets replaced by a criminal justice system. Violence against women has been in decline in the last 40 years, at least in the United States. This is domestic violence. This is rates of rape and sexual assault, and victimization of children, violent victimization of school like bullying, and physical abuse and sexual abuse by caregivers. Okay, let me just, how are we doing for time? Am I, keep going?
I would wrap this up pretty quickly because I want to start giving you pushback.
Yes, okay. So let me, here we have, I'm going to just really talk these literacy. Female literacy, that is girls being sent to school as opposed to being cloistered at home. We've gotten smarter. The Flynn effect is a rise in IQ scores. In quality of life, the work week has gone down over the last 150 years. We have, I'll skip over that, too many lines. We have more leisure time than we used to. And we have gotten, not in general, happier. At least you would expect that, given that wealthier countries tend to have higher levels of reported life satisfaction, as shown in this graph, which plots happiness against log income. And in a majority of countries, though not all, there's been an increase in happiness. The United States is not one of them. We've gotten a little bit less happy. And contrary to a widespread myth that suicide has never been higher, suicide rates globally have plunged by about 40% over the last 3 decades. So again, the United States is something of an exception. Our rate has crept up from its low point. Okay, we can get to the environment. The story is more complex, but let's, I'll wrap that up. That's why I believe that there has been such a thing as progress. I suppose you could say it's optimism. I say it's not so much optimism as being aware of trends that tend to be withheld from news coverage because the news concentrates on events. It's more likely that something that happens suddenly is bad than good. A lot of these things are improvements that creep up a few percentage points at the time, so they never make a headline. It's only when you look at data that you're aware of them. And so my point really is that looking at data instead of headlines alerts you to the fact of progress, and that can be seen as a kind of optimism.
Okay, so the first, and I'm going to try to represent my gloomy friends here. So the first source of great gloom among most of the people I know is the election of Donald Trump. So you started writing Enlightenment Now when Obama was still president. And I think it was pretty easy to be an optimist back then. So I wonder, how did the election of Trump change your book project? And how do you fit that into your narrative of progress?
Yeah, there's no question that was not progress. Especially because it did, you're right that it did certainly knock me off my stride, and there was a fair amount of rewriting of the draft when that happened. I did not foresee it, and that was certainly a lack of something on my part. I wasn't alone. I think it surprised an awful lot of people. But it struck to the heart of what I thought were the values that actually drove progress. Because I don't think progress happens by itself. It's not a force of the universe, quite the contrary. It depends on certain ideas. And almost every one of those ideas, Donald Trump was the opposite. Like cosmopolitanism, like science, like knowledge and individual rights, and progress itself. Trump's inaugural speech has gone down in history as the American Carnage speech. And the slogan "Make America Great Again," the idea that we have to look backward to a golden age as opposed to looking forward to progress in the future. So it was there's no question, it was a negation of all of the core ideas. So the question is, how much was this a reversal, and how much of it was a local setback? Now, I don't want to claim that the election of Biden proves that this was just a blip, but it does seem to suggest that this is not kind of a reversal of what I think of as the direction of history either. And a lot of things got worse in the Trump years. Not everything. Racism, amazingly, continued to decline, as best we can tell. GDP per capita globally until COVID continued to go up. Obviously, it wasn't under his control. And we can hope that the overall currents that I think got us to the progress that we had will resume. Obviously, not entirely, because there still are authoritarian populist currents within our own country and in other countries. But it suggests that the more liberal, Enlightenment, humanistic, cosmopolitan currents have not kind of rolled over dead.
So the other big source of dread is climate change. You just alluded in one of your slides to the environment. So a lot of people think they might grant all that you've said about progress and everything is looking great, but they worry that climate change is going to bring that crashing to a halt. So what's your response to them?
Yes, well, it could. So again, progress is not it's not an inexorable force. It's not a juggernaut. It depends on solving problems. That's what progress consists of. If we take the problem seriously, I think we have the means to solve it. That doesn't mean that we will take it seriously enough. But and I think it's an interesting open question of how do we solve this problem? It's the biggest problem in human history. There's no guarantee that we will solve it. I think the fact that we have made progress in other problems suggests that we absolutely must not just throw our hands up and say, let's enjoy our carbon while we can, and it's going to be our grandchildren's problem. But see climate change as an open problem for which we aren't sure about what the solutions are going to be, but we should explore them energetically, being willing to change our minds as data comes in. And I think the general direction is going to have to be, this is my view, this is what I argued for in the discussion of climate change in the book, that we've got to make clean energy so cheap that everyone opts for it as a matter of simple economics. That would be, has a number of advantages over the, I think, impossible goal of undoing the Industrial Revolution, going back to a low energy lifestyle. I think we're not going to do it, and I think a couple of billion people in the global south are certainly not going to do it. We've enjoyed our affluence. The rest of the world is going to want theirs. They have a right to it. Affluence absolutely requires energy. The challenge is, how do you provide abundant energy without destroying the climate? And so renewables obviously are going to be part of it. I myself have argued that they're almost certainly not enough, that we also have to look at nuclear, including fourth generation nuclear. In the book, I also argued for the other half, that there's sort of making clean energy cheap. The other half is making dirty energy expensive by a carbon tax. And since the book came out, I've had second thoughts about a carbon tax, even though it's what the majority of economists, both left-wing and right-wing, endorse. For one thing, it's just politically so toxic that you put in a carbon tax, and then people put on yellow vests and they start burning cars. So people hate a carbon tax, and it's not trivial to implement it in a way that won't strike the poor more than the rich. You and I can afford a carbon tax. Someone who drives a truck for a living, it's a whole other matter. So you can see why they can be mad about it. And partly the influence of Ted Nordhaus and the Breakthrough Institute, he argues that we might make more progress in climate by some kind of quiet, below the table regulatory changes that aren't immediate red flags that people will come down on like a ton of bricks, either from the left or the right. But government mandates to buy their own cars and trucks from zero emissions sources, to implement various mandates for percentage of electricity that's to be generated from clean energy, things that are so wonkish no one even notices them, but that might have a kind of a snowballing effect that might prime the pump so that it makes clean energy cheaper and cheaper. Anyway, my mind is open as to how to do it, but I'm pretty convinced, having looked at what has driven progress so far, namely energy capture, that the challenge is not how to get people to forego affluence, they're not going to do it, but rather how to make affluence not depend on burning carbon.
So I had 5 years ago, I had Naomi Klein, the activist, the left-wing activist and author, come to Stevens, and she was talking about her book, This Changes Everything. And she said that that global warming, the adverse effects of fossil fuels show that we absolutely have to have some kind of serious reform of capitalism to take care of this problem. So I just wonder what your response is to that. What do you think that capitalism really does need to be transformed or rolled back in some way for climate change and maybe for some of the other problems of industrialization?
Yeah, to put it mildly, I disagree. For one thing, climate change is such a serious problem. It genuinely is a serious problem. And that she and I, and I'm sure you agree, that our efforts should be to solve climate change. And if we say, well, let's use climate change as an excuse to abolish capitalism, for one thing, all the people who agree that climate change is a problem but disagree that capitalism is a problem are going to abandon ship. And we don't want that. We really want to focus on the problem. And the problem is so hard that we've got to deal with it as directly as possible, not to look at some other problem and say, well, climate change will be a happy byproduct, especially since we have no reason to think that abolishing capitalism will be particularly good for the climate. The track record of communist countries was much worse. The worst climate criminal in human history, at least in terms of CO2 emissions per amount of wealth generated, was Maoist China during the Great Leap Forward, where he had millions of peasants set up backyard smelters, which produced enormous amounts of carbon with zero economic output. And capitalism in its current direction, which is, there's no such, all capitalism in reality is always coupled with regulation and a social safety net, even in the United States. So a kind of libertarian utopia or dream just doesn't even exist. So when you're talking about capitalism in practice, you are talking about regulation and a social welfare. The question is just how much. The opposite of capitalism, say, Soviet or Mao style communism, is worse for everything. It was under the Soviets that we had Chernobyl. It was under the Soviets that there were the Belgian smokestacks and with not much human benefit, but enormous environmental cost. So yeah, so I would, the disagreement is pretty strong. Capitalism is one of the things that helped drive extreme poverty down from 90% of humanity to 9%, most conspicuously in China. It's the part of modern capitalism consisting of regulation ought to be strengthened, but still, that's what the future is going to look like, and that's going to be the context of dealing with climate change.
Okay, I'm gonna look at some of the questions that we've gotten. Actually, let me, I'm sorry, I have so many questions of my own. I will get questions in here, but one is, you made a choice in your book, a rhetorical choice, to go after some of your fellow intellectuals and the media for focusing on what's bad in the world and for ignoring all these positive trends that I think you've provided overwhelming evidence for. But you, of course, acknowledge that we have serious problems remaining. And when it comes to basic injustice and human rights, as well as material progress. And it seems to me that we need the critics, we need the complainers to have a continued progress. They are responsible for the progress that we have so far. So I guess I'm just asking you to respond to that.
No, I mean, it's certainly true that you can't solve a problem unless you acknowledge that there's a problem. So that is undeniable, and I have huge respect for the kind of journalism that exposes problems that might have been ignored. But it's crucial that there also be the shared understanding that solutions are possible. Now, of course, not absolute solutions, that solutions create new problems, but the problems are tractable, that our institutions are not so hopelessly corrupt and ineffectual that we may as well just bulldoze them and hope that anything that rises out of the bubble will be better than what we have now. And I think both the radicalism, both of the Trumpian right and of the radical left, comes from I think a failure to appreciate that as a liberal democracy, a free press, science, they're better than the alternatives. They have a track record of making things better. And if you just say everything is a fail, everything is a disaster, then people will naturally just want to smash the machine. And they'll be cynical about the possibility of incremental, wonkish, policy-driven progress. It's when we appreciate that that's happened, and that doesn't come naturally in the culture of journalism. That I think we get people more empowered to try to improve things, as opposed to just rioting or destroying norms and institutions, as we see from both the right and the left. So in a way, it's I tend to think that the old kind of liberal, meliorist, progressive, small p progressive, the idea that we really can make society better, suffers when you have a culture of journalism that just constantly, well, first of all, that it is anecdote driven as opposed to data driven, because the improvement is in the data. The anecdotes will almost always be negative anecdotes. There'll be riots, there'll be murders, there'll be terrorist acts, there'll be wars, there'll be pandemics, there'll be depressions. Whereas when we actually do make things better, it kind of creeps up a few percentage points a year and compounds. So I would like to see in journalism, combined with the incident-driven reporting, something more like the kind of coverage you get in the sports pages, and the weather and the finance pages, where you get something more like a dashboard, a continually updating record of, well, how are we doing for CO2 emissions? How are we doing for homicide? How are we doing for poverty? How are we doing for violence against women? And sort of track the data as a way of at least telling us whether our policies are moving the needle in the right direction or the wrong direction.
I'm just scrolling through the questions here. I'm going to paraphrase one. What about, there's been a lot of concern about social media recently, and that it is exacerbating our political differences and creating these echo chambers, and this is leading to, it's kind of undermining our democracy. So social media, what do you think?
Yeah. So, social media get blamed for everything nowadays. And there's a little bit of a built-in bias in a lot of the media coverage of social media, because the mainstream media correctly identifies social media as their biggest economic threat. And I do think that seeps into the coverage, and they get demonized for every negative trend. Probably, my reading of the data is that the effects of social media have been overhyped, although the effect of cable media are real. That is, Fox News had a much bigger impact on the Trumpian move than Facebook or Twitter. And there are good data that show that when Fox News was introduced to regions, they got more conservative. But there are other phenomena behind our polarization, such as residential segregation, where educated people hang out with other educated people in cities, leaving behind the less educated, the economically less well-off, the more conservative, resulting that people on the left and right have fewer occasions to talk to each other. There's a kind of a cycle of mutual demonization that once it's started, it's not so easy to undo. And it's obvious on the right in Fox News and in Rush Limbaugh, where it's constant demonization of liberals. But as you and I know in academia, every time a conservative disagrees, they're called a racist or a misogynist or a transphobe or a homophobe. And so they're going to decamp and say, well, to hell with that. Right? If every time I open my mouth, you're going to call me a racist, I'm going to join some other group.
Here's kind of a related question from a colleague of mine. It has to do with, she noticed that the upward trend in happiness had an exception, and that's the United States.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if you can comment on why Americans aren't as happy as they should be, or as some of their peer countries.
Yeah, it is. It was a major discovery in writing Enlightenment Now that the United States is kind of a backwater in a lot of these trends. So if you just look at data comparing good things, crime and obesity and drug addiction and illegitimate births and happiness and suicide, we're not number one. We're in the teens, and other countries, the Commonwealth countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Scandinavia, they kind of beat the pants off us in all of the good things in life. And it's including both violence in terms of crime and, of course, war, because it's been the United States that has flouted the so-called liberal international order, often conflated in people's minds with the US-led liberal international order, which is a huge confusion. The United States is a kind of rogue state when it comes to international norms and treaties. And one of the misconceptions that I keep having to ward off is that when I talk about Enlightenment values, I'm talking about the West in general, and the United States in particular. The United States is an anomaly in almost all of these data. Better than sub-Saharan Africa and better than a lot of South Asian countries, better than a lot of Latin American countries. But we do, considering how rich we are, we really don't do very well on measures of human flourishing. And it'd be an interesting story why. Happiness, now we started off pretty happy, so part of it is just there wasn't that much higher that we could go. But we have gone down, and our suicide rate has gotten worse since the low point of around 1990. So probably our weaker social safety net might be part of it. Partly our federalist program of devolution to states means that a lot of good ideas, if they were applied nationally, there are holdouts in a number of particularly southern states, and they've kind of dragged the national averages down. But it's an interesting question why it's kind of turning American exceptionalism on its head, not why America is so special, but why our performance is so crummy.
So Stevens is a tech school. lot of computer scientists.
I spent much of my career at the sister school at MIT, so I know.
Yeah. So one of my students actually has asked a question about artificial intelligence. We're hearing all these prophecies about artificial intelligence rising up like in a sci-fi movie and taking over the world, or getting rid of all our jobs, turning us into some kind of dystopian surveillance state. So what about all those scary predictions?
So there are three distinct threats there. One of which I think may be serious, and that is the automation of work, the fact that truck drivers and forklift operators might be put out of a job. And there, I don't know whether there will be new jobs that take place of old ones, and so unemployment will be constant. That's possible, that maybe the unemployed forklift operators will be, tattoo removal technicians or video game costume designers. That's one suggestions. We can't, just as when elevator operators were put out of a job, or switchboard operators, wheelwrights, all of these professions that vanished, but new positions materialize. So that's one option. I'm not such an optimist that I would say, oh, of course that's going to happen, but it might. The other option is, if there is widespread unemployment, then it could call for a rejiggering of our economy towards more of a negative income tax, more of a universal basic income, more of a national service corps, that maybe the government would give jobs to the unemployed, the technologically unemployed, to do things that machines still can't do, but that need to be done. So I don't see that as potentially a problem, but certainly not an existential threat. But it might be a challenge. The second one is I do dismiss, and that is the computers rising up and dominating us. I think that comes from a confusion in people's minds between intelligence and dominance. It just so happens that one species, Homo sapiens, has both, and that's because we're products of evolution. But there's nothing that says that a device that's designed to achieve goals more effectively is going to have among those goals dominating humans. That's just I think, a non sequitur. There's a more sophisticated version of the takeover fear, and that is not that AIs will try to dominate us as an explicit goal, but just that will be collateral damage. That you'll give an AI a goal of, say, curing cancer or regulating the greenhouse gas emissions, and it will kind of relentlessly implement that regardless of the cost to human well-being. It'll turn us all into guinea pigs in involuntary cancer experiments and give us all cancers to hasten a cure. I think that's almost self-contradictory, because that would not be intelligence. That would be stupidity. So I tend to think the first is worth taking seriously, the second and third not so much.
This is a little bit off topic, but at the end of your book, you're sort of singing the praises of science, and I became a science journalist because I love science as well. But you explicitly say that one of the goals of science is to render the world intelligible, and it just seems to me that I don't know, particle physics and the effort to understand consciousness are going very far away from what is intelligible. So I just wonder how much faith you have in this grand project of science that goes back at least to the ancient Greeks, of understanding reality.
Yeah, pretty far, although I am among the many controversial things that I have said was to endorse an argument from Colin McGinn that that was inspired in part by Noam Chomsky, who himself was inspired by David Hume and others, there may be some things, some truths about the way the universe works that we just can't wrap our minds around because we're human beings with human minds that evolved to think in some ways. And if reality is such that the best explanation of something is just one that just can't register with our primate brains, then we might be kind of out of luck. Now that can happen if it's just so complex that without years of advanced mathematics, you can't even understand the theory. And I suspect that's the case in a lot of physics, where I just got to sort of nod my head and say, oh yeah, well, okay, that sounds good to me, but I'm not going to understand it just because I haven't had enough math. There may be other cases where it's more qualitative, and perhaps the so-called hard problem of consciousness, the nickname given to it by David Chalmers, but the problem of subjective experience, sentience, of why seeing red looks red as opposed to just being different from green. It may be that there is some little nugget that is just forever mysterious to us. So I acknowledge that might happen. That problems like, how do I know that your red is the same as my red? And if someone were to produce an exact duplicate of me, atom by atom, would it have my consciousness? If I was destroyed and reconstituted from new molecules in the same configuration, would I have been murdered, or would it still be me? Can I upload my connectome to the cloud and live forever on a chip? We might always feel frustrated, a little bit frustrated.
All right, so we're at an hour, but I've got one big question left for you. And the question is really, how far can we go? And I want to read you a quote from your former colleague, Edward Wilson, former colleague at Harvard, the great biologist, Edward Wilson. And he said this in a book that was published in 2014. This is a direct quote. "We have enough intelligence, goodwill, generosity, and enterprise to turn Earth into a paradise, both for ourselves and for the biosphere that gave us birth." That's the end of the quote. So I wonder if you agree with that, paradise, which is, and even it's even more, people are even more, scholars are more reluctant to use that even than the word utopia. The question is really all those trends that you're showing, the decline of violence, the increase in human rights, the increase in racism and sexism, increase in prosperity. How far can they go? Can they go to the point where we can actually start talking about utopia with a straight face?
I'd say no, and I think there'll always be some prejudice. There'll always be some homicide. There'll always be some pollution. But I think we shouldn't worry about that, because if we could cut down poverty by half, and then cut it down by another half, if we could cut down violence against women by half and then another half, if we could avoid a climate disaster, even if temperatures rise more than they should, but not so high as to cause mass suffering and migration. I think that's good enough. And I think that we should, because some utopian schemes have led to disasters, such as Maoist China, the problem with utopia is that anyone who opposes your scheme is infinitely evil. And the problem is that it assumes that everyone's going to agree on everything. The problem is that it ignores trade-offs, that if you have perfect pro-social behavior, you can't have perfect freedom, because some people will do bad things. If you have perfect equality of outcome, you're not going to have perfect equality of opportunity. So any good society is going to be a question of coping with these trade-offs, and the attempt to attain perfection can lead to, I think, outright harm as we try to squash features of human nature that are always going to be with us. But that's okay, because we can do an awful lot better, and that's what we should strive for. So I argue.
Okay, I think I'm going to end things on that note of sort of pessimism with a little final uptick of optimism.
Or you could say the other way around.
Yeah.
There's optimism. I think things can be much better. I don't think things can be perfect, but it's kind of a moot point. We'll let our grandchildren worry about whether they can get to perfection. If we continue to reduce extreme poverty, if we deal with climate change, if we reduce violence, if we reduce poverty, that'd be pretty good. But let's try for that to begin with.
Okay, I do have to ask one final question, though.
Okay.
What about in this not perfect, but really great world, as you envision it, will there still be religion, widespread belief in God?
I think there will be religious institutions, whether they'll be, and I think there will probably always be some vague spiritual, but not necessarily religious sensibility. That seems to be where the population is going. I think belief in traditional religions will go down, counteracted by higher fertility rates among the religious, which is true of every religion. So we've got kind of two trends going in opposite directions there.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve. If we were in person, there would be thunderous applause at this point, and I'm sure a standing ovation. I just want to tell people in the audience that this talk is being recorded, and it will be posted on the Stephen's YouTube channel, I think. But Steve, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, John. And sorry I couldn't see the people at Stephen's Tech in person, but thank you for your attention.